Hi, and welcome to Open, the show that opens the Bronx and the rest of the world to you. I'm Kibin Alleyne, and today we'll update you on what's happening in Anne Arundel Borough. Coming up, a report from NYU's Brennan Center for Justice states that low-income Black and Latino New Yorkers continue to disproportionately face charges for minor-level offenses. The senior research fellows at NYU's Brennan Center for Justice goes into details about their findings. Then the harsh truth is that Bronxites simply do not have adequate access to healthy and affordable food. We are joined by a Foodway Coordinator for the NYC Department of Parks and Recreation and an artist in residence for Bronx River Alliance to tell us more about an idea that could help combat food insecurity in the Bronx. After that, the Bronx Arts Ensemble is facing severe budget cuts. We are joined by the Executive Director to learn more. And finally, there is a proposed state law that would raise the minimum wage for tip workers. Some workers and restaurant owners may be against this law. The Executive Director for NYC Hospitality Alliance speaks about what this law could mean for the hospitality world. So stay tuned, all this and much more is headed your way because we're now officially open. Hello everyone, I'm Kibin Alleyne and today is Tuesday, April 16th. You are now watching Open, a program that brings the Bronx and New York City straight to you. Don't forget to stay connected with us via social media at BronxNet TV. Misdemeanors make up the majority of criminal cases filed in New York City. However, despite efforts to reduce unnecessary enforcement and promote more effective alternative responses, racial disparities in minor offense cases persist in New York City. Between 2016 and 2022, Black and Latino individuals accounted for nearly 50% of the city's population, yet they consistently represent over 80% of those charged with minor offenses. Senior Research Fellow for the NYU Brennan Center for Justice, Dr. Josephine Hahn, joins me to discuss. Doctor, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Kibin.
Now, what motivated your team to conduct this research, and why is it important to shed light on this issue?
Yeah, we were funded by the MacArthur Foundation. So a small team of Brennan Center researchers obtained 7 years of non-public court data where we could dive into misdemeanors, violations, infractions, meaning typically disorderly conduct, shoplifting, driving without a license, simple assaults, to understand what was happening behind the numbers, particularly over the height of COVID in recent years.
Now, were there any unexpected or particularly striking findings that emerged during the analysis process?
I mean, as you encapsulated really well, misdemeanors actually comprise most of the criminal court system, which is widely unknown. 75% of cases involve these misdemeanors. Over 60% of them do not involve physical harm to a person. And yet we saw massive declines in New York City to celebrate, over 50% declines in misdemeanors in particular, from over 200,000 cases in 2016 to just under 100,000 in 2022. And yet, as noted, racial disparities really remain the same. So we looked citywide, and when comparing our resident population to people with involved cases, we saw that Black people had 6 times more likely than white people to have one of these minor offense cases.
Now, I'm really glad that you also pointed out what those offenses were, and it could be something as little as driving without a license, maybe it could be expired. There's just so many ways, and I think it really helps put it into perspective how minor these cases are, but how we, again, see that disproportionate effect of how it's affecting marginalized communities. How do these findings align with or challenge existing narratives or perceptions about the criminal justice system's treatment of marginalized communities?
A lot of popular opinion and media coverage is about more serious crimes, so we wanted to shed light on the fact that these types of low-level offenses are really what drive our criminal system. And we did find, just in line with other studies in New York City and other places, that despite reforms, that racial disparities really remain the same or get worse.
Now, I want to talk a little bit more about that. Despite a decrease in absolute number of misdemeanor cases, why have racial disparities in enforcement remained consistent over the years, or, as you mentioned, possibly have gotten worse?
There are a couple things we did to examine that. One, we scoped out of the criminal justice data into our neighborhoods. We tried to take a look at what neighborhoods, what was happening in the neighborhoods with the most misdemeanor arrests. And it will not come as a surprise, but we found that most of the neighborhoods with the most arrests were largely low-income Black and Latino communities in the South Bronx, in Central Brooklyn, in East Harlem. And we saw higher levels of poverty, unemployment. For example, in the South Bronx, some of the neighborhoods like Mont Haven, Morrisania had poverty levels of over 55 to 66% of families were living on $55,000 or less. The unemployment rates in the city were about 7.5. In these communities, they were double or more.
Now, can you talk a little bit about, it's from 2016, I believe, to 2022. You know, what was the effect like when we had that little moment with COVID? You know, did we see it go down? Did we see it go up? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So during COVID, we did see enforcement trends go way down. So where in all other years of the study, misdemeanors comprised about 75% of cases, over COVID we saw a steep decline, and misdemeanors were about 68% of the cases, and overall criminal cases were quite low. And that was actually seen across the nation.
Now, can you speak to any challenges or limitations encountered during the research process, and how did your team address them?
We always say that quantitative data is one particular type of knowledge and truth. We think it's really important to understand what's happening behind the numbers from the people that know best. So we also engaged 166 stakeholders from law enforcement and the business community, nonprofit providers, local government officials, as well as, in particular, impacted Black and Latino community experts who have witnessed and experienced the criminal system themselves.
Now, beyond legal consequences, did the report examine any secondary impacts?
Yeah, so we confirmed in our study, as seen in others, that the cases, most of them by 2022 ended in a dismissal, but took a long time, about 3 to 4 months on average, even if they ended with no conviction. And then when we were speaking to people across the range, we found a lot of common ground from law enforcement to impacted communities that these were driven by ongoing disinvestments in Black and brown communities, lack of access to resources, which led to concentrated poverty, higher unemployment, lack of access to quality treatment for mental health and other health issues. And these were really the drivers where constant and punitive-only criminal justice responses really exacerbated, made worse all of these problems.
Now, can you expand? You mentioned that a lot of them end in dismissal. Can you just expand, like, what that means, and, you know, what impact could this be having on, you know, the people affected by this?
Right, that's a great question. So dismissal means that the case did not pass muster. There is no charge, no plea, and the case ends and are removed from the record. So even if cases for misdemeanors, even with an arrest and even if they end in no conviction, they have lengthy and long-term consequences as seen in the research. Lost jobs, lost housing. I actually did a lot of observations right here in the Bronx Criminal Court, particularly around misdemeanor cases, and I saw a lot of the same directly around people really struggling with what are really poverty issues around addiction, lack of safe and affordable housing, lack of stable jobs, and these court cases made them worse.
Now, what are some alternative responses to misdemeanor enforcement that have been found to be more effective?
So what we heard from our stakeholders and in growing evidence, the research base and other studies, were that there are promising approaches to reduce enforcement and continue to try to address these racial disparities that persist, including court alternatives in the system, especially on the front end. An example is Project Reset, which tries to resolve the court case within the day with voluntary services and no other court involvement. And we also heard a lot about the need for alternatives to behavioral health responses, both crisis, you know, in coordination with law enforcement, a co-response model, as well as non-enforcement models, which are piloting here in New York City called Be Heard, with trained medical professionals as well as social workers who respond to behavioral health crises instead, also in coordination with law enforcement, of course. We also heard about a lot of community alternatives, including a model that's developed by the nonprofit Fountain House. That's a very person-centered approach where people decide and contribute to the Clubhouse model. And we also heard about the co-production of public safety needing to work across law enforcement and government and nonprofits, and especially our communities who know best what they need to build public safety in building up their physical infrastructure, their green spaces, their urban gardens, their community events, really leading the charge in what they need.
I like to hear that there's also like redirection, because I think that is also really important when we talk about racial disparity in the criminal justice system. I'm curious to know, we talked about the effect it could have on these individuals, but how does it affect the community at large? And that could be, children, all the way to senior citizens or elders.
Absolutely. The effects are not just individual people struggling with lifelong consequences, but families and communities writ large. It really exacerbates the ongoing disinvestments, strips people of access to jobs and housing, and that goes often for their families as well.
And we've been having, just as a society, we've been talking about racial injustice, especially since, the protests, in 2020. What are some ways that, I guess, throughout your research, or maybe some of the community organizations you've worked with, that everyone can kind of try to at least help make a difference when it comes to racial disparities in the criminal justice system?
That's a great question, Kibin, and a generational one. But the thing that always heartens me is that people on the ground in communities, community experts and leaders, as well as amazing community-based organizations, are always working to build safety. It's really incumbent on, and more criminal justice actors are really taking the charge to build these partnerships across systems in health and housing, and also in the nonprofits and people that are building safety in their own communities. So, check out the people that are doing the work, ask them what they need and how we can support and build partnerships, and that's what we try to do in research as well.
Now, we got to talk a little bit before the interview, and you told me a little bit about the work that you do outside of this. I'm curious to know, what actually drew you to this type of research?
Oh, that's a great question. I was a middle school teacher at a public school also here in the Bronx, a very well-resourced private school called Horace Mann. I also volunteered with the young people and their families in the juvenile justice system. They're largely coming out of reentry and in Harlem. And I really just saw what racism looks like when it's borne by amazing and powerful Black and Latino young people and their families and communities, and tried to find solutions in partnership, ever since. Use research, use, what people are saying, all kinds of data and expertise to shine a light on real solutions to safety.
Now, can you tell us a little bit more about the research, Brennan is doing outside of this?
Sure. So we are definitely not just, keeping our research in these reports. We're setting up a lot of meetings with law enforcement. We're also building community workshops because we know that our experts both own the knowledge and expertise, but also know all of the things that are in our reports. So we want to build these workshops to make sure that we are giving back in mutual exchange and supporting their priorities and needs to build safety.
And what do you hope to see for the future of this type of research? As I mentioned previously, over the years in any field, whether it's medical, criminal justice, we've learned about racial disparities. What do you hope to see be the overall outcome, following this type of research?
A great question and a hard one. What I always want to see across all of the systems I worked in, education, public health, and criminal justice, is to really build equity approaches, which I do understand is generational work, with communities, impacted communities at the lead of this, to see these racial disparities lessen and disappear.
Well, Doctor, I want to thank you so much for joining us. This was a really interesting and important conversation to have. As I mentioned, we're constantly talking about racial disparities and facing it head on, because I think previously it was something that was in the background or something that we didn't want to address. So I'm so glad to see that your organization is really working to, address this issue. So once again, I thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation.
Thank you so much, Kibin, for having me.
If you would like to learn more about this report, please go to their website at www.brennancenter.org. Don't go away. We'll be back with more Open after this.
Hello, my name is Tyrone Lowe. I host a show at BronxNet called The Legends, where I bring real legends, DJs, upcoming artists, actually people from the past that's into entertainment. I want to thank BronxNet. First of all, I want to thank for the 30 years of the actually being active here. It has opened a lot of doors for me to the point where I'm branching off to have my own network. Fulfill your dreams here. That's all I have to say.
Welcome back. The Bronx River Alliance has partnered with several community-based organizations to address the issue of food insecurity in the Bronx. Their collaborative efforts resulted in the creation of the Bronx River Foodway. It's the first of its kind in the borough, offering edible food forests to the community. In light of this initiative, we're joined by Nathan Hunter, the Foodway Coordinator for the NYC Department of Parks and Recreation, and Journei Bimwala, the Artist in Residence for the Bronx River Alliance, to discuss this effort. Thank you both so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Yes.
Now, as we mentioned, food insecurity faces millions of New Yorkers, but I'm curious to know, how does it uniquely affect Bronx residents?
Well, historically, the Bronx has been disinvested in, especially when it comes to food. We're located along the Bronx River, which is adjacent to the Hunts Point Terminal Food Market, which is the world's largest, or the United States' largest food distribution point. So just thinking about that example for a moment, the proximity to that space, and then the conditions of that community and the lack of access of that exact produce is disparaging. So we're out here with this edible food asset addressing that.
And I'm definitely curious to learn a little bit more about that, but I want to talk about the negative effects of food insecurity on a person's health. Can you just explain, what effect this is having on people in the Bronx in regards to their health?
Well, when it comes down to the health, right, our health is built on the food that we can eat, and therefore food that we get to have access to. And with the Bronx, with the disparity that's being experienced there, it affects every single family not having access to not just any old type of food, there's also the quality of the type of food you get to have. And that's usually attached to economics, how much money you can actually afford, and what is accessible within the community that you're living at. So these are challenges a lot of families face. And then when you include the different types of allergies, right, that some family may face, gluten-free allergies, any kind of dietary restriction, and none of those items are in the neighborhood that you live in, and therefore you may continue to use the same food that may not be healthy for you, but then that's all that you have. So it becomes generational, and you can see the outcomes of it when you just look at the health of the borough.
And, I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because I think that even myself, unfortunately, we have these ideas of, like when you mentioned gluten-free, like we don't think that is something that happens to people in our community, and it does. It's just that we don't have the access to even treat it or, face it adequately. And that brings me to my next question, is that despite making efforts to lead healthier lifestyle, there's been this idea that people from low-income areas just don't want to eat healthier. Can you talk a little bit more about, what you've learned, in regard to that, or what you've seen in regard to that? Because I think there's a lot of responsibility put on the person, but even when they try to make those changes, it's not like they have a lot to choose from. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. That is really incredible and funny. I laugh at that because it's everyone wants to be healthy. No one wants to be sick, and everyone wants to live a lifestyle that they have the energy, they have the health, and they can see their children and so on and so forth having good state of health. What makes it difficult, again, is access. If I am gluten-free and the supermarket and all the food in my area don't have gluten-free anything available, then what am I to do? And then it also comes down to the prices. Everything is going up. So you have to get to a point of survival. Those families are surviving, and they have to make really hard decisions. Do I spend this money on an $8 bread when I still have other expenses, right? The rent, Con Ed, all of these things. A lot of your necessities are pit against each other. And regardless of where you may get help from, you can have food stamps. But again, if the spaces in your areas don't have what you need, then you just buy what's there. And not having the proper education is also a problem. Not knowing where and how to bring those other items into the space is something that not everyone knows how to do either.
Now, I also want to bring up this point, which, upon my research, although I lived in the Bronx for all of my life, it's not something that like really stood out to me. But unfortunately, the Bronx is reported to have a very imbalanced bodega / corner store to supermarket ratio, which also contributes to the lack of proper resources because, as many of us know, you can't get fresh fruits and vegetables really at a bodega. Usually you're getting quick food, quick service meals. So that's leaving many people, as I mentioned, without fresh produce. But I understand that there is an effort to assist Bronx sites with this by creating edible forests. Can we first just talk about edible forests and what they are?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think we both can speak on it and invite you, Journey, to jump in.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, an edible food forest, we all know forests and kind of can picture them in our heads. It's really mimicking and honoring natural forest landscapes. It's an ancient practice. It's how people related to the land and always had source food to subsist. And it's really mimicking this layering approach. So canopy trees and understory trees and herbaceous plants below that and ground cover to cover the ground.
Yes.
The idea of like nothing is wasted in the forest, nothing is bare. There's always something being inputted or output like fruit. So it's mimicking those approaches, and for us, it's installing it in an urban setting, in a place where it's needed, and then trying to tie the community to the project and offer decision-making without necessarily involving labor.
And
Yes,
can you expand on that?
Absolutely. Like that idea just take us right back to our foundation. All of our foundation as a human species, right? Nature and humans have always operated as one. Nature provides us with food, medicine, materials for us to build things on. That's why we have everything that we have. And by having a food forest, it's also giving back to the community, and sometimes I think to the Black and Brown community, as in, during slavery era, like that's what we lived off of. That's what sustained us. That's where we got our food. That's where we got our medicine. That's where we did everything with. And by restoring that and bringing it back, it's bringing a sense of freedom, because now you get to go into the park and find items that are edible and medicinal, and you can go ahead and make use of it. You can connect with the land and help to take care of the space and build reciprocity with that. You can connect with the plants of your great-greats, right, of your grandparents that have used to help heal yourself. You can connect to that history of where every culture within the community where everyone have dealt with the land and some specific plant at some point. So it brings in collaboration, it brings in community where we get to exchange knowledge and also face the challenges and the fears that we all have together when it comes to this space, because it always comes down to, well, is it safe? Is it okay? How much? So there's like a relearning, but doing it together and really understanding how valuable that is, because COVID showed us that, right? When everything is shutting down, nature was still accessible. And many of us just didn't know what is right to do and what is not right to do. And this space kind of brings that up, secures that, teaches, and really encourage the community to be a community.
And can you talk about the community's response? What has that been like?
The community response has been beautiful and amazing as a process to watch, because for so long you have been told that you can't. And then all of a sudden, you see us in the park and it was like, hey, take a piece. So there was a lot of hesitancy in the beginning. Like, is this a trick? Are you saying yes and then turn around and I get fined? Like, people were really hesitant, but the more of our presence in that space, the more we activated the space through programming and just kind of like showing them how to do it, doing tours, getting them to connect with it in a way that is natural to them and not pushy. Little by little, the community started to come, engage with the space, whether we were there or not. We have family that will come in the evening and harvest some plants. We have others that come early in the morning. Everybody kind of have their time and space that they come and interact there. So it's been really beautiful. And now everyone is getting a lot more comfortable and really and accepting and saying that, okay, this is real, this is here, it's still here, these people are still doing all this stuff, and I can still connect with the plant and harvest them. So it's been really great.
That's amazing. Now, I'd love to learn a little bit more about the Bronx River Foodway. Can you just give us a little bit more background on the organization?
Yeah, definitely. So the idea of the Bronx River Foodway is really a coalition project, and so it was birthed from New York City Parks Department, inspired by a project, an art installation called Swale, that was a floating barge that was brought to Concrete Plant Park that mimicked a food forest, that actually had a food forest on top of it. And it was a way to get community members into an edible food forest without it being on public land, because there is a prohibition against foraging. And so there's actually a law against it. And so the Foodway is this temporary project, this pilot project to explore how it could exist in public lands. And so the Parks Department created this at the time, and still today, called the pilot project, but we're exploring the boundaries of that project and the limitations, recognizing that this was a very big idea that was, so many different folks had a voice in it, and was inspired actually by an art project.
And can you tell us a little bit more about that art project? Like, just give us a little bit more detail about that.
Yeah, so it's a project called Swale. It was created by Mary Mattingly, the artist, and she wanted to initially build this food forest inside of a city park, but was told no. And so she, kind of tongue-in-cheek, built an art project, a giant barge that had a food forest on it. And she brought the same students and community members from that neighborhood onto the barge to be docents of the space, paid them to do that labor. Also, they built the barge. So the students went up north to build the barge up in Albany, I believe it was, or Syracuse. And so just seeing that connection between land, the community, and in this case, water, quite literally, as a water-based organization, the Bronx River Alliance, it's not always just about water. It's about the banks of the river as well. It's about the land beside it. It's about the community beside it. And so that art project kind of brought it all together and created a really clear, articulated vision of what could exist. And then community evolved the project to where we're at now.
That's amazing. And can you tell us a little bit more about the concrete, I think it's
Concrete Plant Park.
Yeah, Concrete Plant Park. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So Concrete Plant Park originally was a concrete plant. And, you know, young adults eventually and people from the community wanted to have access to the water. And the best way to have access to the water was through there. And that plant was abandoned over the years. And, you know, so it was just abandoned. There was really nothing happening there. And it took the young people to protest on Westchester Avenue to get attention to really the problem and situation and what the community wanted, to get that kind of going, which eventually led to Concrete Plant to turn into a Concrete Plant Park. So that is how that kind of came to be. And from there to the Swell to now having the food forest on it, it is turning to be a place of peace, a place where community can find healing when they need healing, get together. It's a really beautiful place where that same space held a lot of dark moment for the community at large. So to see that transformation getting started by young people and all of the things that it's gone through has been really beautiful.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for joining me and kind of sharing a little bit of your community and just, you know, ways that you're trying to help assist the Bronx live a healthier lifestyle with more access to nutritious and healthy food. So thank you both so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Appreciate it.
Stay tuned. We have more Open for You right after this. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I remember when the Bronx did not really have a media outlet properly representing the people of the Bronx.
BronxNet provides for the community by being a community where people can be empowered to share their voices.
We are in a really great place technologically. We've got all the resources that we need to be effective.
Whether it's through cameras, storytelling, editing, we have provided those services for 30 years.
BronxNet's mission is to be a voice for the community.
To educate, to inform, and to inspire.
And you can be a part of it. We've built studios for you.
Welcome back. The Bronx Arts Ensemble, a nonprofit organization founded in 1972, has received funding from the city's Department of Cultural Affairs for over 4 decades. The organization's primary objective is to provide music and arts education to the Bronx while offering free performances to New Yorkers. However, given the recent budget cuts, the city's arts and cultural institutions, including the Bronx Arts Ensemble, could face significant challenges. Executive Director Judith Insell joins me to discuss how these cuts are affecting their mission. Judith, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Kibin. I'm so glad to be here to talk about this important subject.
Now, can you just, I gave a little bit of a background, but can you just tell us a little bit more about the Bronx Arts Ensemble and what programs you offer?
Bronx Arts Ensemble has grown to be a major force in the Bronx, where we have equally live performances and arts education programs inside of public schools throughout the Bronx. And our live performances are also throughout the Bronx and under regular circumstances.
Now, I also want to add how amazing it is that we have an organization like this in the Bronx, because when we think about arts and culture and entertainment, we always think about maybe going to Manhattan or, going to another borough. But it's so amazing that something like this is happening in the Bronx. But as we mentioned, unfortunately, there has been budget cuts that are affecting the work that your organization does. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, as I had mentioned, under regular circumstances, we are accustomed to serving about 20,000 people every year through our annual performances, live performances that take place throughout the Bronx, in every single part of the Bronx. We are usually in every single district throughout the entire borough performing. We are an organization that prides itself in being creative placemakers. Basically, we come to your neighborhood and we present the performances that are adapted to what each neighborhood is accustomed to. We are a culturally responsive organization where we have a lot of discussion with the different community leaders about what arts and culture is relevant to them. So with the recent budget cuts from the Department of Cultural Affairs, unfortunately, Bronx Arts Ensemble did not receive funding this year to do our valuable work for 20,000 people. So we've had to make adjustments. There was basically no way we weren't going to have performances. We've been in business since 1972. We've seen a lot of things happen in the Bronx. So this is just, I consider, a hiccup in the life of the institution, where we have modified what we're doing. We are finding ways to have performances, and we are going to as many Bronx neighborhoods as we can possibly go to this year. I should point out that we have great support from some of the council members, particularly in the Bronx, to help us to get to their neighborhoods. So understanding that the Cultural Development Fund money that we usually rely on to go to the Bronx neighborhoods is actually not there this year. We've had certain council members provide us with allocations to make sure we keep going. We employ the musicians that come out and perform, who happen to be members of the local 802 union, part of the AFM, American Federation of Musicians. So we are a union organization as well. So we're making it work. The Department of Cultural Affairs will hopefully resume our funding after all these decided budget cuts are hopefully reviewed and realized that it makes a great impact on every community, that arts and culture needs to be funded.
Now, I understand that you talked about this situation a little bit more at the city council hearing. Can you tell us a little bit more about that experience and how did it go?
It was a very interesting experience. I've been down to City Council before to testify, but I have to say this is the first time I've ever been there where I've heard testifying coming from major institutions in the city like Lincoln Center and Carnegie Hall and Brooklyn Academy of Music, and us all going there and speaking about how every single one of our institutions had been cut in some way in funding, which was resulting in cuts in programming or even the termination of administrative positions. It's impacted the entire industry of arts and culture in New York City, and we all agree as the institutions that New York City is arts and culture. So it's kind of a bad thing to have us all suffering through these cuts together and trying to figure out how to go on with our work.
Now, I love that you mentioned that, because when people think of New York City, they do think of the arts and culture. They think of like the shows and the music, and that's what brings so much life to the city. Can you just tell us a little bit more about the importance of, you know, having just kind of that be a huge part of our identity in the city, but you could also kind of focus it a little bit more in the Bronx?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that the Bronx has amazing arts and culture. We have had movements come from this borough, in particular, the movement of hip hop. And even long before hip hop, there was lots of cultural music, vibrant music in different communities. And that's the one thing I think that has helped Bronx Arts Ensemble be around for like so many decades. It's over 5 decades we've been around, because we actually work with the communities and support what the music and culture is of each community. So in the overarching scheme of arts and culture in New York City, I think all the cultural institutions are doing that. That's why people come, because you know, if a tourist comes from somewhere else, they know about the vibrancy of all these different cultures coming together, and they can have amazing experiences here through the work that we provide in our institutions.
Now, how important are collaborations and partnerships in sustaining activities at the Bronx Arts Ensemble?
Well, they're pretty much everything right now. Our partnerships range from higher education partnerships. We have a new residency at the University of Mount St. Vincent that we started this fall. We've had relationships with other universities like Lehman and Borough Manhattan Community College, and Bronx Community College, and Fordham University. These are all relationships that have happened over the decades that we've been in existence. And we have some new relationships that have grown in the past few years. We have a very strong relationship now with the New York Philharmonic, where we have presentations where they come and collaborate with us in the Bronx, and also with the Metropolitan Opera as well. They come and collaborate with us here as well.
Now, can you talk about any upcoming events or initiatives that the Bronx Arts Ensemble has planned despite budget constraints faced by the organization? Because as you mentioned, you found ways to push through, and I love to hear that. So what events could people see coming up in the future?
I think we've done a pretty incredible job in actually making things happen where there seems to be no way to make them happen. So we actually have a lot of performances. We are kind of at the level of performing that we are used to, again, because of these council members. Council member Dinowitz, Riley, former council member Velasquez, with the support of council member Marmorato. We're going to all these districts, and we are also going to council member Felice's district as well. The flip side of that is we're used to serving the entire Bronx, so we're not going to be in all the different areas that we normally go to. We have concerts that are coming up with collaborative institutions like Courtney's Stars of Tomorrow. We have 2 performances with them next week, actually, April 19th and 20th. We are back at University of Mount St. Vincent on May 5th for a collaborative performance with their art department, so it will be a multimedia experience. We have 3 big performances at the Mall at Bay Plaza, which is very great partner of ours. When we want to do something big, we go to the mall. We know everybody's there.
Right.
And so we're going to have our spotlight on 3 teaching artists that we have who will be doing performances and workshops and samba dance, Congolese drumming, and capoeira, which is a movement and music art form. And we'll be back at our 2 summer venues that are outdoors, which are Pelham Bay Park and Van Cortlandt Park, with a number of offerings. We have 7 performances scheduled. So this is like us trying to be business as usual.
It sounds like you're doing it pretty well. There's so many events happening, and it's like, as you mentioned, in so many places that people are going. So I think just from what I'm hearing right now, you guys are still doing an amazing job. You know, I'm curious to know, what are your hopes or expectations for the future funding of Bronx Arts Ensemble, both in the short term and long term?
Well, I'll say that we are hopeful that the city of New York will remember that we've been doing this work for so long. And just because we're trying to make things work now, the reality is that these are all in certain parts of the Bronx, and there are other populations in other parts of the Bronx that can't actually afford $2.90 each way to come to them. So we come to their neighborhood, and so we need the support from the city to actually continue to come to all these different rich cultural neighborhoods and do our performances.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us and having this really important conversation and talking about the work that you do in our community. I appreciate it. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
To keep up with the Bronx Arts Ensemble, please go to their website at www.bronxartsensemble.org. We have to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Open after this.
BronxNet is a wonderful place because it inspires people that want to consider a career in film and television. It's a way to come, learn, it's cost effective, and it's a way to actualize your dreams.
Hey everyone, it's your girl Kat from the Kitty Rose Lifestyle, also from The Next Chapter, where we discuss shades of gray every week right here at BronxNet, Saturdays at 11 p.m. Wow, 30 years. 30 years of BronxNet public access television. I'm a girl from Brooklyn and came to the Bronx 25 years ago, started my journey on BronxNet on public access television in 2016, and BronxNet is where I got my start. BronxNet, I feel like, is a home away from home. They support all of my endeavors, and I wouldn't have been able to be on any of the other channels if it wasn't for the fundamentals that I learned right here at my start here at BronxNet. So I am so appreciative. My son says I should stop telling people I'm from Brooklyn because I've been here now, Bronx Strong, for 22 years. So I'm so grateful, and I wish you much success in 30 years, 30, 30, 30, 30, 30, 30, 30, 30 more, because public access is necessary so that people like myself can have a voice. Yes, BronxNet, it's your girl Kat from Kitty Rose. Check me out every Saturday at 11 p.m. right here, Channel 68, The Next Chapter, where we discuss shades of gray. Mwah.
Welcome back. A proposed new state law could have a significant impact on the dining scene in New York City. The proposed legislation aims to raise the minimum wage for waiters and bartenders. Andrew Rigie, the executive director of the NYC Hospitality Alliance, joins me to discuss the potential implications of this law for restaurant owners, servers, and customers. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Now, as I mentioned, there's a proposed bill looking to raise wages for restaurant workers. Can you give us a little bit more information about the bill?
Yeah, so restaurant workers like servers, bartenders who customarily receive tips are paid in a different way. It's called the tip credit structure. I'm sure most people, if you've been to a restaurant, you tip, you are somewhat familiar with it, but it's a little bit more complex on the backside. The easiest way for like a non-restaurant person to understand it is it's kind of like a commission sales job where if you're a server or bartender, you get paid a base wage plus a commission, which in this case is a tip. And it also, or I should say always must equal or exceed the full minimum wage, which in New York City is $16 right now. But what would do is the proposal would eliminate this tip credit that allows those tips, at least part of them, to be used as the wage to make the base minimum wage. So it's a little bit complicated, but it has real big implications for restaurants because if it was eliminated, it would cost a lot of money and could impact how people are or how much people are earning.
Now, when you mentioned it's kind of for non-restaurant people, it's a lot. I definitely have to expand on that because I think that if you're not in this world, it's just so different.
Yes.
Just the way we talk about wages and money is very different in the restaurant world. What has the response been like from those who are restaurant owners or workers?
So restaurant owners are extremely concerned. Running a small business in New York City is really, really tough. And during the pandemic, it got even tougher. And we saw so many small businesses shutter. So many still have pandemic-era debt. So the cost of eliminating the tip credit for small businesses would be astronomical. So they think it could put them out of business, they'd have to lay employees off. And a lot of tipped workers are also concerned because, they want their jobs, they want to be employed, depending on where you work, the type of restaurant you work, the amount you're earning definitely can vary a lot. But, if you're at a job and you're making money, you certainly are concerned with a government policy that could potentially impact you if it could have negative consequences. And this is one of those things where it's tough to know what exactly would happen. So I think there is a lot of concern among both folks, and like everything else, there's a lot of different opinions.
Now, as you mentioned, many restaurant owners fear that the bill could lead to potential layoffs. But as somebody outside of this, I'm curious to know, is there any validity to that concern? And, why is this something that they're foreseeing?
Yeah, well, so actually the timing here in an unfortunate way kind of helps. Last May Washington, D.C. began eliminating their tip credit, which is what this New York State proposal would do. And since last May, I think D.C. has lost over 3,000 jobs in the full-service restaurant industry, where they're starting to eliminate the tip credit. And the surrounding counties that didn't eliminate the tip credit actually stayed the same or saw an increase. And when you compare that in D.C. to limited service restaurants, like when you go up to the counter, and I know because of the pandemic, a lot of people are used to tipping for their coffee and everything, but those restaurants where you didn't traditionally tip, they didn't see the same loss. So, if you're just looking at D.C., there's real reason to be concerned because thousands of jobs have been lost.
Now, you mentioned something that was really interesting, and I know that many people have experienced this, and it's, after the pandemic, people turning around, the little things so that you can pay tips. Can you talk about tipping culture and, how it's been since the pandemic?
Yeah, I think early on our, restaurant workers were like essential workers, and people wanted to be as generous as they could. Obviously, they were working in really difficult circumstances with public health and everything, so people were being really generous. But what ended up happening was it kind of got ingrained in the restaurant industry. Like when you would go at a sit-down restaurant, you'd be used, it would be custom to tip. But, like old school, you go to a coffee shop and you pay at a counter, if you had some extra change, maybe you put it in the tip jar. But technology changed it where it could flip it around and you tip. And obviously, it becomes very difficult once people start making more money and getting used to tipping for all of a sudden restaurants to kind of take it away. So I think, at least what I've heard is, when people are sitting down at a full-service restaurant and tipping, that's always kind of been part of the culture. But more of the concern has been, or things that sometimes people don't love, is like, okay, every time I'm going to go and pay something at the counter, why am I expected to tip? And sometimes the tip's like as much as the cup of coffee or whatever it is you're ordering. But when it comes to this tip credit issue, it needs to be really clear that we're not talking about, you know, the limited service, flipping around the screen tipping. We're talking about the tip credit that's applied in a full-service restaurant when you're sitting down and someone's actually coming to your table and taking your order and bringing you your food.
Now, in a survey from your organization, 76% of restaurant owners say they would increase menu prices if the bill went through. Is this a necessary adjustment, and if so, why?
Yeah, so it could cost about $12,000 per full-time tipped employee if the tip credit was eliminated. So you could think of even a small restaurant that had, you know, 5 full-time tipped employees. I mean, you're talking about tens of thousands, getting close to, you know, $100,000 a year more. And, you know, a lot of small business owners, if they're even making that, you know, they're lucky. So if they had to increase prices to offset that, that means prices are going to go up a lot. And I mean, anyone that goes out and eats anything, you don't have to go to a fancy restaurant, just a casual restaurant, it's a lot, especially if you want to go on a date or take your family out. So, you know, one of the problems with this proposal, it doesn't only impact restaurant owners and workers, but it can make it a lot more expensive for the everyday person to just go out and get a quick meal.
Now, I'm curious to know, you know, 42% said that they would consider eliminating tipping to keep costs down. But if tipping comes from customers, why is there a need to eliminate this?
Yeah, so what we've also seen around, you know, the country where this movement has happened or it's been considered is kind of going back to what I was saying. If restaurants have to increase their prices so much, they don't want to then say, hey, customer, not only are we raising our prices so much, but now you have to still tip on top of that. Customers are going to be scared away. You know, not everyone has enough money to just, you know, pay 10% more in prices and leave a 20% tip. So what restaurants have said is, you know what, I just raise my menu prices and tell the customer that they're no longer expected to tip. But what would happen then is that a restaurant worker would just become like a retail worker where they're paid, you know, a straight hourly wage, let's just say, you know, $17 an hour, $18 an hour, but they don't earn the tips that can bring them up to $20 or $20+ an hour, which is why a lot of people work in this industry as a server, as a bartender. Yes, you get the base wage, but you're really working for the extra money in tips.
Now, I want to talk about the other side of that. Many say that this could eliminate bias when it comes to tipping culture, ensuring that all workers are paid fairly. And I want to mention that Assembly member Jessica Gonzalez Rojas says that women of color are tipped much less than their white or male counterparts. Can you just talk a little bit more about that? Do you foresee this possibly eliminating that bias when it comes to tipping?
See, that's one of the big problems, that like people are either misleading people or they're saying something that hasn't been fully thought out. You know, the tip credit has nothing to do with tipping it themselves. You know, I've read a lot of different studies, and you could have arguments on both sides, that people earn tips based on different factors. The color of your skin, your weight, how you're dressed. All of these different factors play into how much someone may leave you a tip. But what they're saying is, let's eliminate the tip credit, but let's keep tipping. So in my mind, if you're basically saying tipping has all these societal ills and outcomes and disparities, but we should keep tipping, you're actually kind of perpetuating the problem that you're trying to get rid of. The tip credit, by eliminating it, makes menu prices go up, makes restaurants struggle, and could result in workers getting fewer hours or even losing their job. But it does nothing to get at the disparities that you're referring to, which would be to eliminate tipping, pay everyone the same hourly wage, because then, you know, tipping won't influence it, and everyone, in theory, at least is being treated equally in that sense. But every time the conversation comes up, like, oh, maybe we should eliminate tipping to address this stuff, tipped workers of all different, you know, backgrounds come out and say, no, 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 I want to earn my tips. So it's a complex issue. There's a lot of strong opinions and a lot of good points on each side, but I think you have to look at it at the totality, and that would say, keep the tip credit, but then try to work and address some of the issues that you just raised.
And I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because I don't think there's like a one-size-fits-all approach. There's so many members in this industry, and in ways, customers are kind of a part of the industry, not really to the same effect, but, you know, we're part of that bubble or that ecosystem, and there's just so many moving parts. You know, from your experience working in this field, you know, what do you think is the best approach to this situation?
You know, I think restaurants are really a reflection of kind of culture and society at large. People from all different backgrounds, all different neighborhoods own, work in them. So many people at some point in their life have worked in a restaurant. And I think businesses need to have the flexibility to operate in a way that works for their own business, as long as they're following all the different laws. They're paying the minimum wage, they're paying overtime, they're following, you know, various different laws. But I think when government in particular comes in and tries to really start to micromanage how this complex and large industry operates, it ends up having a lot of different ramifications. And while maybe there's some winners, there can also be a lot of different losers as well. So I think keeping the tip credit, keeping that system in place makes the most sense. And we need to support our small businesses, because just like cultural institutions and parks and all these other amazing entities, restaurants are also part of that social and also economic fabric in New York that people love, and that makes it so special.
Now, where can people go to just learn more about you and the work that you're doing?
Our website is the nycalliance.org. I'm on Twitter at Andrew Rigie, Instagram, Political Foodie. I try to talk about politics and food and the intersection of all of them.
Well, I appreciate you for coming here. One in person, that's a great,
Yes.
moment to have. But just to really talk about this, because I think it's not something that a lot of consumers really think about. And initially I thought, well, yeah, that's great, to raise it. But I didn't even think about all the adverse effects it could have on the restaurant owners and the workers themselves. So thank you so much for joining us and clarifying that.
Yeah, and I would say two quick things for you. Is one, that everyone should know that restaurant workers, tipped workers in New York are required by law to earn the minimum wage. No one is legally earning less than. And the second one is, thank you for having me on throughout the pandemic. You've been doing such great, work and reporting on so many important issues in the Bronx.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We've come to the end of our show today. I'd like to thank all of our guests for joining us and you, the viewers, for tuning in. If you miss any part of today's show, you can catch the Recable cast at 5 and 10 p.m. on Optimum Channel 67 and Verizon Fios Channel 33, or watch anytime on the web at BronxNet.org. You can catch a brand new episode of Open with Darren Hemick on Wednesday and with Irina Valentine on Friday. I'm Kibin Alleyne, wishing you and yours safety and wellness now and always. See you next time.